Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Jackie Bailey is my guest on the podcast today. Her debut novel, a work of autofiction called The Eulogy, was published by Hardy Grant in June 2022. I don't think I've heard of the term autofiction before, and until picking up The Eulogy, I hadn't read a book in this genre. Irrespective of genre, however, this book was deeply moving and funny, confronting at times as well. A book about death, grief, love, and the effects of intergenerational trauma. Made all the more moving and memorable by the fact that the book draws heavily on Jackie's own life and experiences. Jackie is a writer who holds a PhD in creative writing from the University of New South Wales and has written for a variety of publications, including the Sydney Morning Herald, ArtsHub, ScreenHub, and the Australian Journal of Human Rights, amongst many others. Jackie is also an independent funeral director and ordained interfaith minister, holding a Master's of Theology, who is passionate about end-of-life care and providing meaningful, authentic and affordable funerals for people of all non-faiths and faith backgrounds. Reading Jackie's beautiful book and understanding more about her journey makes this part of her working life all the more significant, and I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with Jackie about her book today. Welcome to the podcast, Jackie.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudine. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm delighted to have the opportunity, and I wanted to say congratulations on the publication of The Eulogy. How are you feeling about it?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, relieved. Relieved is the dominant feeling because I'm pretty old and it's my first book. And so when you get a book published that you love, but you don't think is ever going to be published, it's a massive relief.
Oh, I don't think you're as old as me, but but I appreciate what you're saying.
Count the white hairs. Yeah.
Now, this book was a long time in the pipeline, wasn't it?
Yeah. I started it. My daughter, I can't call her my baby anymore. She's 11, but she was a baby when I started it. Yeah, she was 6 months old. And so I wrote it on and off over those years. And yeah, she's 11 now. So on and off over the 10 years and finally got it out there.
Yeah, fantastic. Jackie, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about your inspiration for writing this book.
Well, this book is all about me and my sister. So in the book, the main characters are Kathy and Annie. And in real life, I guess they're loosely based on me and my sister, Alison. Yeah, so Alison was diagnosed with cancer when we were just kids, but she survived, but with pretty debilitating disabilities. And she died in 2015. Mm-hmm. So I was already writing the book when she died, but I was writing it about her and me and loss and what it means when you're so close to someone, but you have to leave them to, carve out your own life and family. So I was writing this book as a way to say goodbye to her. Yeah. And then after she died, it became as a way to honour her as well as saying goodbye.
Jackie, I mentioned it a little bit earlier before we started recording, but I've spoken to hundreds of authors now, and everyone without exception comes to writing and publication from such different pathways and with a set of unique life experiences. But I have to say yours are a standout. So I wondered if you could tell me about your decision to become a celebrant and funeral director and how these careers influence your writing.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, because I'm old, I've done lots of different things, and obviously I can't stay still for long enough. I think that's a blessing and a curse. But like I was saying to you before, I think I found my groove now, hopefully. Everybody hopes around me as well as me. But no, I think I have. So after my sister died in 2015, obviously we organised her funeral, and I felt like we did a pretty good job of her funeral. The thing that really pissed me off was the funeral home that we hired. And, sometimes you have good experiences, but a lot of people were probably like me and felt like they were just kind of gouging us at a very vulnerable time. I found it just really disappointing and then enraging. And so that I'd been kind of interested in death and dying my whole life, because when you live with someone who is dying your whole life, of course, you're going to be thinking about that. After she died, I took some time off from writing the book, for obvious reasons, because it was all about her, so I needed a bit of time. And I did my Master's of Theology and trained as a funeral director because I wanted to be able to give people good funerals the way that we'd done for my sister. I just felt it could be genuine, meaningful work and an area that I could be of service, because, you know, I always think you've got to find that niche for yourself. And for me, that's about writing, and it's about death. I feel like that's where I can offer the most.
So, Jackie, for those who haven't read your beautiful book yet, I was wondering if you could tell me more about it.
I guess there's two ways I talk about this book. One is just sort of the plotty summary, which is that it's about a woman named Kathy Bradley, who's kind of at a crisis point in her life. She's on the run from the police, and she's avoiding her husband, and she's got a container full of sleeping pills, which she's planning to take when she finds out that her sister, Annie, is about to die. So she hightails it up the M1 to be there when her sister dies, and then she has to organize the funeral and write the eulogy. And in the process of writing the eulogy, she unpacks all the family secrets, and in an effort to work out how they have ended up where they are as a family, but specifically how she has ended up where she is at this point in her life. So that's the kind of plotty summary. And thematically, this book is about love and grief and disability and trauma, and how Australians deal with all of that with humour. That's certainly how I have dealt with all of that in my life. Yeah. So I try and make sure that there is a bit of lightness throughout the book.
Yeah, indeed. And there absolutely is. So you've nailed that aspect of the story. Jackie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your decision to make this autofiction and not memoir. And for the benefit of those who don't understand the difference, could you maybe elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, no worries. I think autofiction is a pretty recent term. So when I was writing, I started writing it as memoir initially 10 years ago, but because I was doing it as part of a PhD, you get readers along the line, and they recommended that I think about fictionalizing it so that I'd have a bigger canvas. So, you know, you've read it, Claudine, so you know it goes back and forth in time a bit. So I can go back to Singapore under, you know, during the war, and my dad's experience in the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff you can imagine your way into if you're fictionalizing something. And it also means you can create a bit of a safe space, a bit of a bubble between you and the material. And you can create drama that, you know, in a shorter time frame than normally happens over an actual life. So, you know, I've got this woman on the run from the police, and I've never been on the run from the police, just FYI. So I don't actually know what that's like. So I had to imagine that and make that stuff up. So memoir, often people will fictionalize parts of memoir, and they'll have that disclaimer at the outset. And often people will write novels and not call them autofiction, even though they do draw on their lives quite heavily. And that's all been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But I called it autofiction because it was important to me that people knew that this is emotionally true, and it is true, and certain things, not all of it is true factually, but I think it was important because for me and my sister Alison, we often didn't feel like we had a voice growing up in, you know, in a big family and in the disability system, dealing with that system. So when I came to write this book, it was super important for me just personally to say, this is our truth. But it was also important for me to have a bit of safety. So this is our truth in a fictional setting. Yeah, if that makes sense.
I loved the way that you explored in this book the system, for want of a better word, and the way that the system deals with young disabled people. And in the book's case, there is an aged care home versus a more appropriate setting for Annie, who is still too young to be in an aged care home, but obviously too disabled to be still at home and vulnerable. Can you speak to us about that and your experiences with that and how it influenced this aspect of the novel?
Yeah, that was something else I was really passionate about telling, that story. So there's a couple of sides to that, Claudine. So thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate that. It is an issue in Australia and elsewhere that young people do end up in aged care well before they should be. And excuse me, I mean, there's lots of issues with aged care for anybody, let alone young people. In my actual life, my sister was put into aged care, and we saw her decline so quickly once she was put into aged care. You know, she went in, so she was put into aged care because she couldn't swallow anymore, which is a whole other issue that sort of came up in the context of the disability system. You know, I won't bore you with that. You can read the book. You can read my rage on the page about that. Yeah, and then she went into aged care and, you know, pretty quickly lost any remaining sort of physical capacities that she had. You know, she went in there and she could still, you know, move her hands and move her head and even, I think, take a few steps. But after just a matter of a few months, she couldn't even hold her head up by herself, which, you know, and she's got a big, noisy, educated family around her. And someone was always there trying to make things better for her. So it just really, I find it so scary to think of what would happen to people who don't even have those resources available to them, which my sister did have available to her. And we did lobby and we did the whole media thing to get her into a high care group home for young people, which do exist. There's just not enough of them. And we got her into one, but it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because you just know you're bumping someone else off the list. You know, the government's not suddenly building another group home for my sister. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was a bittersweet victory, but at least she spent the last year or so of her life in a living rather than dying, is how I like to think of it.
As someone who has a disabled mother, I think it is it's unfair that in many respects, negotiating these, you know, very difficult systems and bureaucratic processes is often left to the very well educated, but it's anathema. Those who most need it are often don't have those people at their disposal, you know, people to advocate for them.
And yeah, I mean, you just couldn't. You'd just be left to deteriorate and die, essentially. I know those are pretty hard words, but that's the reality that we're talking about, which is why it's so enraging. The other thing that was really important to me writing about my sister and her life was that she did have multiple disabilities, including intellectual disabilities, but she was still such an influence and such a person, you know. She took up her space. I feel like we need more of those stories as well. People, right, it would be great if more people with intellectual disabilities could tell their stories. You know, I tried to tell her story, but I was really had to be so careful about not speaking for her because that happened so much in her life. So when it came time to putting her voice sort of in the book, I was so reluctant, Claudine. It wasn't until the structural edit, actually, which is quite towards the end of the process, that I did it. And I did it by going back and looking at her journals that she had written when she could still write. And yes, some of the lines are basically, I just read them and just laughed, you know, because her voice was there, her very cheeky, very sardonic, self-deprecating voice. So I just put that on the page.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to honour her. Absolutely beautiful. Kathy, your alter ego in the eulogy comes to learn some incredibly confronting information about herself and her family over the course of this novel, as you indicated earlier. And without being too indelicate, I wondered if this was difficult for you to write.
Yeah, that's an understatement. It was pretty difficult to write. It's one of those things too, like some books, like I've been always probably temperamentally, I'm a writer, and I've tried to write other things before, but it wasn't like, this was the thing I had to write and I had to finish. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s, married, my own family and home, that I felt safe enough and comfortable enough to write it. So some people are like me and come to it late for all sorts of reasons, and that for me was a big one. So I'd done, you know, like you've done all the therapy, you've done all the like meditation, yoga retreats, like I'd done all the self-care, I'd done all the work. I was like, I'm ready, I'm going to write this, it's all good. But I did still have to have a fair bit of like mental health scaffolding in place to write it, because it was pretty confronting, and just going back and thinking, oh yeah, it was pretty shit. Those things were pretty shit. And once you have your own kid too, you see things through a different lens. So I kind of developed more understanding and empathy for my parents, but I also never came to the point where it wasn't about forgiveness, and that wasn't a goal for me which is lucky because that's not something that I would have achieved. But but I don't think you have to forgive people to see them a bit more clearly.
Kathy questions her memories in this book, but she feels the knowledge of what happened to her at a cellular level. And there's much discussion out there about whether trauma is something the body remembers as well as our brain. Is that how you feel?
Oh, yeah, 100%. 100%. And there's in the work that I do around funeral work and death and dying, you might have seen that Australian story with Tender Funerals, which is a not-for-profit funeral home not far from where I live. Anyway, they're a great bunch. And that's where I started. When I started funeral work, I started volunteering for them to begin with. And the person who set that up, Jenny Briscoe Hoff, she said that she really encourages people to touch and wash and care for their person after they've died, because it's a cellular knowing that there's like a transfer that has to happen, so that you know intellectually the person's died, but to really know on a physical level, touch is really important. And I've seen that as well, and I've experienced that with the people who in my life who have died. So, and the research also bears me out. So of course, I'm like, well, this is my subjective experience and this is anecdotal, but I'm a total research nerd, so I had to look that up as well.
Yeah.
Trauma, but not just trauma, resilience and courage I think they're all internal in the cells of your body.
I was also especially interested in your exploration of race and racism in this novel, because I think Kathy didn't think too much about her heritage until she saw herself through other people's eyes or the way other people described her. It's something I've kind of experienced at some point, in my life, growing up. Can you tell me more about that? And was that confronting for you as well?
Yeah. So when you say non-Australian, do you mean non-Anglo-Australian?
Yeah.
For you? Yeah, because I'd say you and I are totally Australian.
Oh, I am Australian and I identify as Australian, but my heritage is not Australian.
Yeah. And that's just what I'm trying to say is it's an interesting kind of almost a Freudian slip in a way, the way that we even talk about how people have made us feel other. Because, I didn't realize I was any different until kids in the playground told me I was, and then it became really apparent, and then all you think about is how you can try and be more white. I don't know about you, but that's and I didn't even realize that's what I was thinking. I thought what I was thinking is trying to be more beautiful or more attractive, but essentially in Australia and in other countries, that means looking more like a white person's version of beauty is. I mean, that's a whole other conversation we could get into. Yeah, so that was a super interesting process to go through, because so much of it is unconscious for me and possibly for others. So when I was writing it, I was unpacking it and I was identifying it. I think I'm still on that journey, Claudine. Yeah, I reckon because I married an Australian Chinese man who, is the opposite of the type of person I was supposed to marry. And that was probably the real clincher for me of going, you know what, I'm going to embrace this identity because I love him, despite what everybody else is telling me who I should love and who I should fall in love with and who I should find attractive. But that also means that I can challenge the way that I think about myself.
Did your family's reactions to the contents of this book concern you in the lead up to publication?
Yeah, a bit. But so I because I did it as a PhD, so I sent them the dissertation version when I submitted that. So I kind of felt like they'd had a pretty ample opportunity to get back to me if they had any issues, and if they hadn't read it, that's on them. And then I did call them all though, but I waited until after I'd signed the contract with Hardy Grant, because I wanted to it was so important that I was telling my version of this story. I mean, I did say to them, if there's anything really, that you don't want me to talk about or whatever, then let me know. I only said that to the people in the family that I like, though. There's a lot of us.
The love that Kathy has for her dying sister Annie is a source of such poignancy throughout this novel. Kathy feels both guilt and gratitude towards her sister, and it affects her ability, I think, to be able to form meaningful relationships with other adults over and above what she suffered as a child. And I think that anyone caring for a disabled or terminally ill family member can relate to this internal conflict. And you've written it so incredibly well. I wondered if you could tell me more about this and how it informed the story.
That is one of the biggest reasons I wrote this story. Yeah, just to be able to articulate and process the guilt and the gratitude, because also when you've got someone in your life who's got such needs, but you don't, I think you can get a bit of survivor guilt happening. Yeah. And it's not rational, but it's still there. It's still real and it's still your experience. And I'm such a black and white person. I just wish I could have been the kind of person who could have stayed in Queensland. And if, for a long time, I thought I would move back and take care of my sister. Failing that, I thought, well, why don't I just move back and just be around? But I couldn't do it. I had to be completely separate and have a separate life in a different state in order to have a life, because we were so enmeshed. Yeah. So, I mean, I went back a lot and I did a whole lot of advocacy, but the best thing I ever did for Alison was get her out of that aged care home. And that felt good. That was one of the only times I felt good about what I could do for my sister, and just hearing myself say that, I can hear how hard I'm being on myself. And I hope that other people who are in that sort of situation, you are doing your best. You're always doing your best, even when it doesn't seem like it or feel like it, but you are. And, my sister didn't want me to be unhappy. You have to remind yourself of that as well. She didn't want me to stick around and, sacrifice my life for her. That wouldn't have worked either. It's just a bind, there's no solution. You're just a bunch of people just doing your best.
As you said, it's Kathy's job to write her sister's eulogy. And the book is divided into instructions from a supposed manual on how to write a eulogy. Now, I understand that this is a fictional resource, but in your work, is this something that you counsel people about, how to eulogise the life of their loved one?
Oh, yeah, all the time. And that's what gave me the idea for structuring this book this way, because when I first started doing that work with people, I couldn't find a good guide on how to write a eulogy online. But what I could find was really pat advice, which might be relevant if you're trying to write an obituary for like a businessman or something, like someone totally different to my sister. So, write about their career and their legacy and blah, blah. It's like, well, how do I write about the career and legacy of a person who spent a lot of her time in hospitals? But she absolutely did have a legacy. So I kind of got that structure and then pushed up against it. But in real terms, when people ask me how to write a eulogy, I always recommend that they do tell a bit of the timeline of the story, well, I'm just giving myself away really, because it creates the story of the person's life, and that's what you're doing. But then they make sure that it's not all about that they include some meaningful anecdotes to them. And people ask me how to end a eulogy, and my advice there is to, you've told this story, but to the people in the room, but at the end of the eulogy, bring it back to a conversation between you and your person, and address them, because this is your opportunity to say goodbye.
I understand, Jackie, that you turned away from the faith that you were raised in and are now more concerned about living a spiritual life and helping people to achieve that with or without religion. And I understand that you're in the process of producing a work of nonfiction in this space. I wondered if you could tell me more about that.
Yeah, you've done your research, Claudine. You're a total research head. Yeah, I am. I'm writing a book. This one's nonfiction. I think that's probably the way I'm going to work really as in my author life, is go fiction, nonfiction, nonfiction, something like that, because I am a research nerd. I can't help myself. So yeah, this one's nonfiction, and so I did all that study looking at the sort of the traditions, the major religious traditions around the world, when I did my interfaith ministry course and Masters of Theology. And at the same time as you learn about all the world's religions, you're formulating a path for yourself to be of pastoral or ministerial service in your community. And for me, that's obviously about death, dying, and writing. And that's what I can do. So I'm writing about how spirituality for me has become more of a choice to live as though life is meaningful. because for a long time I didn't think that life was inherently meaningful. I just thought it was a statistical anomaly, in a cold, unfeeling universe. So I read too much Richard Dawkins and those guys, I guess, and thought that was the cool way to be. But having done that study and spent a lot of time reflecting on the sacred traditions of the world, I've shifted to a more hopeful space, I think, where I think that maybe hope is a reasonable choice, and you can choose to think that the universe may not necessarily be, I don't think there's a God as such, but I do think that it's fair to believe that the universe is predisposed towards life, because life is so unlikely, that it is reasonable to think that we are co-creating the goodness in the universe. So it's not like we can sit back and just let it all happen either. We're active participants in creating meaning. And so that's what a spiritual life is, in my view. It's not just, it's partly about your own personal journey, of course it is, but it's also about how you treat others.
Jackie, if there was one thing you'd like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
Is it too trite to say hope?
No,
that's a bit trite.
I don't think so.
Hope then. I hope people take away hope from this novel, that you can come out the other side of all that sort of trauma. If you're lucky enough to have resources like a mental health system, and people who love you, and then you can heal and you can do things differently to your parents. That's probably the big takeaway. You can do things differently to your parents. Although, if you had a great parenting relationship, then by all means do exactly the same thing.
Jackie, you might know that there are a lot of writers who listen to this podcast, and I wondered, given your experiences to date, if you had any tips to offer those who might be listening in.
If you're working, well, I would recommend autofiction as a way to tell your story if you're thinking about memoir, because a lot of people worry about, like, they're writing memoir, but they worry they might get it wrong or they might offend somebody, or all those sorts of things. So I would recommend just writing it, like not worrying about censoring yourself at that level, but then later on in the process have a think about fictionalizing and see what happens, primarily in an imaginative sense, because it can open up these different sort of plot drama tools to you that you don't really have in the memoir format, and also what it offers to you in an emotional sort of nourishing sense. It can give you a bit of safety.
Jackie, I have loved chatting with you today about this incredible book. I wish you every success with your work. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thanks so much, Claudine, for everything you do.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.